Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, today we're going to be going through my debate with Inspiring Philosophy on the topic of Are Young Marriages Immoral? I got my good friend GGK here, who's going to review the debate with myself, inshallah. And we're just going to go through the claims that were made and bring up some sources that might clarify some positions that might have not been so clear during the debate. And we're just going to review it and see, like, maybe on some parts what could have been an improvement, and which parts were good, and which ones did actually need a bit more work on. So, yeah, GGK, before we start, maybe we can get your opinion on the debate overall before we start reacting to it.
I mean, I think that well, I think that the arguments that were provided by inspiring philosophy were based on like one core assumption, and I think that that core assumption is like as will be seen throughout the reaction will like be proven false. Um, like basically, the topic of the debate is whether or not like young marriages are like immoral, right? So presumably, um, we're going to hold to like the agnostic stance, which is like, well, like we're the ones who are supposed to see our opponent like provide the evidence that like these type of marriages are like inherently immoral, right? So what this requires is that every single instance of a young marriage, right, ought to be like immoral, not most of them and whatnot, right? And proper argumentation has to be seen. We just have to deal with that argumentation. We don't need to do anything more than that. And I think that this position was very this position that you had, given that your opponent made very poor arguments, and I think you dealt with them to some extent in a good way. Obviously, they could have done some things could have been done better, in my opinion, right? I think ultimately, like you're on the favoring side, like you were you won the debate, in my opinion, right?
Mhm. Yeah, in my opinion, I think I didn't say anything that was too detrimental in terms of what would be seen as completely incompatible with the Islamic view, or something that's, you know, completely absurd to claim, even in light of the science, in light of the history and the sociology regarding the topic. But what happened with him was he did make at least a few really detrimental claims that would have like an extreme effect on the view of the early church, as well as um, just generally the apostolic tradition that was uh, given by the apostles. It puts into question a lot in terms of what morality they taught and the reliability of them, if we are willing to actually concede that the early apostles were teaching that such abhorrent behaviors, such as pedophilia, was okay during those times. You know, conceding that sort of position, I don't think many people from apostolic churches would want to concede that point. Actually, that these churches that were praised and advocated for by Jesus to be a source of theology as well as morality, and obviously most people, they would say these things are intertwined. Why would we need modern scientists to let us know stuff that was already evident throughout history, right? I don't think they found anything new that would actually change our perception on the morality of things regarding like young marriages. But yeah, in my opinion, yeah, I think I mean I was the one that's participating in the debate, so it's kind of hard for me to be unbiased. But from what I've heard, people have said that um, they appreciated my sort of perspective better than Daniel's, as well as even though I think Brother Daniel did do a good job, maybe at parts, especially during the part on precocious puberty, he should have been maybe more clear on that point. But overall, from what I saw in the debate between Daniel and him, um, it was a good display by Daniel, and I think just overall, uh, in terms of how I conducted the debate, I think I could have pressed him more in particular points. However, as I said, like, yeah, I didn't have any detrimental statements from what I could recall. Yeah, we can maybe
Yeah, let's
start
go ahead.
the reaction now. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
All right. I'll put on maybe 2x. See how it.
Try to put 1.5, or like, I don't know. I don't think it's going to be feasible into for like people to also.
So everything's clear?
Yeah.
Okay.
So can you clarify, remind me again what you want to title this?
Maybe 1.5, or is that okay?
Yeah, 1.5, because like the audience is going to, they might not be used to the speed.
Yeah, sure. So it would just be, is consummation after the age of puberty moral? Obviously, I'm gonna be making a distinction between consummation done after the modern age compared to the pre-modern age, because I believe that girls are not psychosocially mature or equipped to consent actually nowadays, or for other adulthood responsibilities. But other than that, physically, I don't see it as a detrimental factor on why I wouldn't permit such young marriages today.
Okay, so when you say reaching puberty, okay, we need to clarify, okay, because puberty starts earlier before even the girls reach the age of menarche.
Yeah. So
do you think? So what is your opinion on that? Do they need to reach the age of menarche, or do you take like Daniel Pikachu's view that as long as there are just signs of puberty, marriage can be consummated?
So no Muslim can really hold to the view that menstruation is the be all or end all. This is because of Quran 65:4. It makes mention of those who haven't menstruated yet have consummated, and then the classical exegetes, they make mention of if this girl has not menstruated in this exceptional case where she can consummate due to young age. So yeah, there's like no disagreement on that. So yeah, the menstruation is not the be all or end all, but you would assume that they'll be close to menstruating at that stage with pubescent features in order to consummate.
Well, menstruation happens in Tanner stage 4.
Yep.
So there's 5 Tanner stages.
Agreed.
So you're arguing you could consummate a marriage with a girl in Tanner stage 1?
No. So as I said,
Yeah, I think I made my position. I made my position pretty clear. So let me just skip that.
My position isn't anything of frontal lobe development. Rather, it's whether she's perceived to be able to uphold adulthood responsibilities within their respective societies, and if she's able to uphold them with, there being no evidence that there's a problem here with her functioning as an adult, then I find no problem in her conducting adulthood responsibilities, including giving consent for consummation.
So you don't think lobe development is important for this?
It's not definitive at all. Of course, like there's major frontal lobe development, like during puberty.
Well, I'm not thinking of frontal lobes. I'm thinking of the temporal lobes.
Yeah, even that. Anything that has to do with neuroscientific findings on this topic, I don't find it definitive at all. And they say themselves that it's not a good way to determine when maturity is. And I see it very arbitrary to say, okay, frontal lobe or whatever a part of the brain you want to actually examine, these parts of the brain don't fully develop until sometimes into the age 30. So I don't see why we're arbitrarily going to pick 18 as the be all and end all where a girl is mentally ready to give consent. I think it's more complicated than that.
Well, there's a reason I brought up the temporal lobes.
Yeah, what do you think about that position?
Like this?
Yeah, in terms of he's trying to present this sort of like an inextricable link between the science and how we deem it to be moral or not, right? But the effects of the science, I mean, I don't see how scientists found anything that would corroborate a sort of point of view to express the idea that it's actually immoral today, but it wouldn't be seen immoral in the past. Like if there's some sort of harm being made or some sort of I guess he's trying to allude to the fact that they're not ready because of this development process. If that was the case, then I'm sure we would have seen people in the past seeing girls have this detrimental effect because their temporal lobes haven't developed enough or the frontal lobe hasn't developed enough. But there's no like evident harm we can see in the past, right?
I mean, if you want, like, if you can allocate me a good 5 minutes, I wouldn't mind like giving like a short presentation from my meager knowledge in like meta ethics and science and whatnot, right? Whenever you want, right?
Mm-hmm. Did you want to do it now in this stream or another time?
Like, obviously, I think I should do it apart in this stream and maybe in another time as well, right? Because it's going to relate to other arguments outside of like young marriages, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, if you want, you can just express that now if you want.
Yeah, sure. Give me a second. Okay, so well, so like I'm not sure like what his entire like inquiry is, right? So if he's going to try to justify his, well, throughout the debate, right? Anyone who has watched the debate, a lot of science was quoted, right? A lot of science, right? Now, from any person who has read like any book on introduction to meta ethics and whatnot, this would seem like a very like a particularly like a moral naturalist way to like argue for these for like these particular moral claims that he makes, such as like, oh, young marriage is like inherently like immoral, right? But the issue with this is this, right? So there's two prevailing theories in like moral naturalism, right? It's the identity theory and the supervenient theory. Now, to make it simple, right, it's the idea that what is moral is identical to what is natural, right? Or like the natural properties of like events. Or the other theory is that what is moral is like inferred from what is natural, right? Now, that's one thing, right? That's about the ontology of things. What exactly is moral and like immoral, right? But the main issue is in this debate, right, is he's asserting that this is like immoral, right? So which means that this is a matter of epistemology. How does he know this? How does he have access to this type of knowledge? How does he know that this is immoral? How does he know that this is moral, right? This is a topic of what we call moral epistemology, right? It's beyond like what is the ontology of morality, right? Whether morals exist, how are morals and whatnot. It's a different question about how do we know morals, right? So there's two main issues with arguing for like moral naturalism, or the idea that, oh, we can just like infer moral facts from like the like empirical observation, right? One issue is that as we know the human brain naturalistically, right? Because obviously, like in any form of like epistemic discussions, we're going to resort to how do we reason to that, and the reasoning skills are like located within the brain, right? One of the main issues is that um, is the brain like something built innately with this moral knowledge, or is it something that discovers it, right? And it seems to say that naturalistically the brain has evolved and it's there for survival. It's not there for discovering. Survival doesn't always have to do with truth, right? And moral judgments are either true or false, right? Because if he's not going to grant that moral judgments, which is like judgments about what's moral or not, right, are true or false, right, then he's going to grant that they're relative to agents, which means that he's like already granting you the debate, right? So obviously he's going to hold that yes, there are true moral judgments and false moral judgments. Now the issue is that the brain does not deal with truth, right? The brain deals with like what helps with like survival and whatnot, right? And you can read about this in like, for example, Joyce R, right, which is like he has a paper called Evolution and Moral Naturalism, right? The Blackwell companion to naturalism, right? And he says most biological traits have nothing to do with truth. It makes no sense to say that one's gallbladder or any of its activities is true or false, right? But judgments can be true or false, and thus any evolved psychological faculty designed to produce a kind of judgment does have something to do with truth, right? Now, he later says one thing, which is that um, however, this is not to assume that the evolutionary function of the moral faculty, which is like how we would arrive at those moral judgments, is to track the truth. The evolutionary function of a trait is the reason that it was selected for. It reflects why it was reproductively useful to our ancestors. In many cases, of course, truth is useful. Our evolved perceptual faculties, for example, are designed to give us approximately true representation of where objects are in relation to us. However, sometimes truth, by the way, I'm not quoting anymore. However, sometimes the truth is not useful to us, right? There's many cases in which truth is not useful, which means that our brains are just there for evolution, not for truth, right? Whereas like how do you call it, like moral judgments themselves are true or false. They're not about what's useful, right? Unless you want to say you want to hold to some you want to hold that moral judgments are sorry that morality is just identical to practical value, right? This act is in my interest, therefore this is moral. Or you want to hold that morality is dependent upon practical value, right? If that's what you want, if that's what you're going to hold to, then that's going to be problematic for inspiring philosophy, because a lot of what is in our interest would be against how do you call it would be against his judgments, right? Like a lot of like contemporary like religion is against our interest. In what way? Some people might have fun in doing X and Y, right? Whereas religion bans X and Y. Some people might have fun in killing people, right? And it gives them, or it's within their interest to kill people. Now, would that really be moral or not? No, like there would be a difference. But if this is rejected, then ultimately he will accept that the epistemic the epistemic access that we have to moral judgments might be wrong, because our brains are not built specifically for moral judgments, because it is not innate, right? Nor do we have accurate reasoning skills to access those particular moral judgments, right? That's like one issue, is that how do we even know what is moral or not, right? And my theory is that we receive this through theological data, right? Because morality is something completely abstract and different from what is natural or not, right? What do you think so far?
No, I think that's a good assessment, and I think that, yeah, as you just laid out, bro, there's an inextricable link between theology and morality. I don't think that theology depends upon some scientific data or assessment of the brain or the frontal lobe or the temporal um, assessment of just the brain in general, and make an inference from that. I think that yeah, as you mentioned, that there's limitations to that, and there needs to be an appeal to a tradition or a scripture that lays out the moral framework for us, and if it's coming from a definitive source of information, or if it's definitive in nature, in that it's an objective source coming from, for us, for example, the Quran and Sunnah, or for them it might be, the consensus of the church or the councils, as well as what's laid out in scripture. Those are sources where we take our morality from, not just theology, right? And this whole shifting of assessment of the brains or assessment of nature, at this point he becomes sort of like a moral relativist, because it's just going to be dependent upon whatever access of information he has to available to him, which would be just whatever science says at that given point.
Yeah, so to resume everything that I've said, right? Basically this is like some form of like, the issue here is that the epistemic agent's access to true moral judgment, it seems to be uh blurred if you reject that, if you hold that, it's linked with natural facts, right? Reason being is because, giving that moral judgments are objective, right? Meaning they're true or false, right? And they're obviously they're not relative, right? And that there are out there moral facts, right? Realism of our morals, right? Then what that would necessitate is that those properties, those moral properties, would be truth apt, right? True or false, right? Now, as I said, that which is true or false is not always that which is useful, right? And since our biological properties, such as our brain, like any form of loci of reasoning to access morals, right, is inherently uh, there for like selection and whatnot, it has nothing to do with what is true or not. So again, we see this blur being established. But there's multiple arguments against this theory of like moral naturalism. There's also what you call the Kantian argument against this. So Kant says that, well, to know what moral facts are, we presumably want to infer them from some general rules, right? Like, for example, consent is necessary for every act, right? Or the golden rule: don't do unto the other what you don't want to be done unto yourself. Those are general rules, which means that you can infer particular application to what's moral and immoral, right? And he says, since we don't have those type of things, right? Um, Presumably, because you want to say that there are no, there's nothing, like, if identity theory of moral naturalism is true, those moral rules are going to be identical to natural rules, right? So they're not going to be something flying out there, abstract rules, right, of reasoning, right? But so that's going to be a problem. But if they're not supervenient, right, they're not dependent, then how are we going to like ever going to have some form of like general rules or whatnot to infer those like moral statements, right? Like, if you want, I could rephrase this in a better way, which he says. So this is how, like, what the encyclopedia about like this is what the encyclopedia like lays down his argument as. He says, if we have moral knowledge at all, we must know a general moral truth from which we can deduce specific conclusions. But B, we could know this general truth on the basis of experience only by generalizing from examples of right and wrong that we encounter in experience. Consider then, as a specific example, an act of deliberate cruelty done for fun. How will we know that this is a wrong act or right act? We must infer it from a general moral truth, according to A, but to explain, we must know a general moral truth, we must be given B, the experience. So what is Kant arguing here? He's saying that if morals are linked to experience, right, or like empirical facts, then we must have a general rule to know what's immoral or not. So when inspiring philosophy argues that, oh, well, this is immoral because of this consequence, he is anti-mimetically assuming a general rule, right? And that's his general rule, which is, he uses to infer that particular actions of young marriages are immoral, right? And from that, he's coming to the conclusion that it is immoral. But the issue is, if morality is linked to empirical observation, then ultimately, right, as how do you call it? As like what's his name? Kant argues, right? We must deduce it from experience. But to know that a particular experience is immoral, we must have a general rule. So this is a vicious circle, if you know what I mean. Do you get that?
Yeah, yeah. I see how there's a circle there.
So like we would presumably want to call something other than those two to explain what moral facts are, and that's where theological data can help, right? That's one of like the main options in like how do you call it, in like it's called like the theological facts, right? We infer moral facts from theological facts. That's one possible solution to this vicious circle, right? I don't want to like yap for too much. I have a lot to say about this, but like,
Yeah, no, inshallah we can expand on it another video, inshallah. But yeah, no, that was really good. And inshallah, maybe you can make a video on your channel soon.
If you want, I can resume this in 10 seconds. Basically, whenever inspiring philosophy will argue that something is immoral, right? He will infer that from a general rule, right? But if that general rule, if morality and natural facts are interlinked, then the general rule must be inferable from the experience. But then we would have to look at the experience to know that something is wrong or right. But how do we know it's wrong or right without a general rule? Vicious circle, right? We need a third party to save us from this, right? Theological data or non-natural facts. But obviously, non-natural facts has nothing to do with science because empiricists do not deal with the supernatural, right? Anyways, let's go.
Jazakallah khair for that. Yeah, definitely. That's a very big detriment that comes about after detaching morality from theology. And anyways, it's kind of like intuitive as well. Who do you take from who would have the best moral guidelines on life? It would be obviously the people that would be closest to Jesus, right? That's that's just like the most intuitive thing. And yeah, even without this whole circle that you presented, it just doesn't make much sense intuitively, even to think for 1700 years, the early church as well as the disciples were teaching such an abhorrent act as being okay. But yeah,
those are things that are like I haven't even considered yet, but I cannot wait to like talk about from my meager knowledge on church history or like common sense. Anyways, go ahead.
The temporal lobes control sexual behavior, and they are mostly developed between basically 14 and a half and 17. I have various studies here. So for example, there's a study called Development Trajectories of the Frontal Temporal Lobes from Infancy to Early Adulthood in healthy individual adults. They say that they basically fill out in size between 9 and 12, but they don't reach peak like networking in gray matter until 14.9. I have another one here. It says the age 16, it's age-related changes in frontal and temporal lobe volumes in men. Now they say here that says research, and we compare it with research done on CSA, so child abuse. We find similar issues. So when we do those type of studies, so various meta-analyses have shown this, we see that when children are engaged in that type of activity, they develop more psychiatric issues, higher levels of depression, higher levels of stress, more mental disorders. So we have a convergence of two different things, the neuroscientific research, as well as the sociological and psychological research, all pointing to this idea that when children, prior to basically completing, around the age when they're completing puberty, and the temporal lobes are being developed, it's not good. It's like biting into a fruit that's not ripe. These children do not know what they're experiencing. They don't know what's going on. And engaging in any type of activity will mess them up, and it doesn't result in good behavior. So from science, we can see it's far better to wait until after puberty is complete, not just when they have reached some of the stages of puberty.
Sure. So yeah, my standard isn't what science is.
One more thing, real quick. Let me just say the study. I said it was 17. It's
examine it, but I'm just gonna take like your word for it. So like, yeah, again, my source of morality doesn't come from some scientific study that tells me when a girl's development stages in the brain happen or what's most optimal. My standard comes from the Quran and Sunnah. It comes from the tradition I have through the Quran and the Hadiths. And yeah, as like the discussion goes on, I'm going to be bringing standards from early Christians, early Jews, early Muslims, unanimously agreeing that they see no issue in this sort of conduct. I don't think some scientists in the modern age have come across some modern phenomena where, okay, now we know there's some harm to these effects that no one prior to us has ever like come across. I don't believe that's the case. So my standard of morality doesn't come from some scientific findings or some inference you can make from scientific findings in correlation to some depression or some negative causes that happen through young marriages. I could just put that to other causes as well. I don't think there's any like definitive case to be made here. If there is, then there's not just a problem for myself, but also the Christian and Jewish and pretty much any pre-modern religions, traditions.
So, Christianity constantly talks about things called, so Catholic.
Yeah, so before you get into like the natural law thing, as I was saying with my point, it's pretty like clear, like even just on a probable basis, that if he's making the claim that young marriages, and not just restricted to this time period, but even in the pre-modern age, had this negative effect that would inevitably happen through lack of development of the brain, he actually has to justify that. He can't bring me studies from the modern age where I already say, yeah, they're not psychosocially developed. Doesn't make much sense, right? And if he says that people like from the past were aware of all these like physical negative implications that come about through young marriages, if it was prominently done in the past and they were aware of these harmful effects and they were willing to express that regarding physical harms, if the mental harms was abundantly clear as well, you would expect them to express that too, right? If you have millions of child marriages or young marriages going on for 1,000+ years, like, is no
I
one
have
going to
like
notice
a
these detrimental effects?
I have a more fundamental issue with what's being argued here, right? One issue is that the topic is, are young marriages immoral? The topic is not, are young marriages with X and Y consequences immoral, right? Like, thank you for providing like argumentation against a particular type of young marriages, but you're not here to argue against types of young marriages. You're here to argue against young marriages inherently, the entire category, right? So you saying, oh well, these people eventually suffer from X and Y and Z and B and so on and so forth. Like, the topic is not, are young marriages with consequences of B immoral? Do you know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
like please.
It's not even is our young marriages harmful, even because even if we grant there's all this harm, okay, well, justify this consequence making it an immoral thing, right? He didn't even justify that either.
Right. Yeah, so here, this entire theory of like consequentialism about morals, right, about ethics, right, which is like, oh, an act is like an act is inherently how do you call it, like immoral based on the consequence rather on the act itself, right? um there's a particular like how do you call it, like someone writes on this, and it's in the Encyclopedia on Moral Epistemology, right? It's like some form of like utilitarian consequence property that applies to, well, this act has this consequence, and this consequence renders the act immoral, right? Now, okay, but as I said, are young marriages immoral is a different topic from are young marriages with X and Y consequence immoral, right? So consequentialist arguments are out of place in this discussion, right? They're inherently out of place as far as I understand with my meager knowledge of like metaethics, right? So I don't see why, like, I can even grant him, yes, this is immoral. For the sake of the discussion, I can grant him this. This would not lead to failing on the topic, on the topic being discussed at hand here, right?
Catholics will say the two books, the book of Scripture and the book of nature. Protestants will say nature is the 67th book of Scripture. It's a very long-standing Christian tradition that we are supposed to study nature to better understand ethics. And so we see this in Scripture, like test everything, come let us reason together. We don't just get our ethics from divine command. Thomas Aquinas, who you cited, was actually in the natural law theory. So we're discovering what is the optimal way for human flourishing. And the way we do that is to study nature, study how humans develop to better understand. So if you're going to cite Christians,
Can you
I'm
stop
going to
there?
appeal to the two books of God, the book of nature and the book of
Yeah. So like, we're gonna see something interesting about Thomas Aquinas. So it's interesting that he recognized that Thomas Aquinas is very famous in metaethics for a particular theory, which is like, like his
Natural law.
form. I forgot like what he called natural ethics theory, right? And I think Aquinas makes arguments like metaphysical arguments, like God is identical to existence. God is good, therefore to exist is good, therefore to not exist is bad, therefore murder is bad. These type of inferences. But then again, if you look at Aquinas, there's a different way that the word natural is used in Aquinas, right? Then it's used in what inspiring philosophy would think is used in like modern science, right? Aquinas is inferring moral facts from metaphysical facts, not scientific observations, right? Big issue. And the second thing is, he again affirms that Aquinas has this very great innovation in metaethics, right? Which later, and curiously, he affirms that Aquinas is looking at natural fact, which again is his misunderstanding, right? But granting that, why does he later go on condemning Aquinas, right? If he's such a great meta-ethicist, right? Why does he go around saying, oh, he's wrong about this? Wait, hold on. Didn't Aquinas look at the natural facts around him? Not just that, he looked at the supernatural facts, the metaphysical facts. Like, how is he wrong? Like, we'll see this later. It's going to be funny.
Definitely. And there's nothing really that, like, even if we grant like his interpretation of what Aquinas is saying regarding the natural laws, they, as we're going to see through the debate as well, he tries to have his cake and eat it at the same time, because he mentions Cyrannus of Ephesus and other people in the pre-modern age where they were witnesses to all the physical harms that were associated with young marriages. They were exposed to young marriages that were happening at their time, and they were exposed to many young girls that were getting married, and yet they never documented any mental harms. They documented some physical harms, but even that was on a descriptive level. It wasn't really on a prescriptive level where they would say this should be prohibited on the grounds of these harms being the case, right? So yeah, even with this whole natural law thing, where's the development? Show me why we should take the science today as a good reference point as to how Aquinas was wrong. Why isn't it just the case that society has changed to the point where now it causes more mental harm than it would in the past? Right? As I make mention with like studies I provide to him, showing there's a social mismatch. And I'm also going to get into like what is the proper way of dictating when someone's mentally mature? What were people in the pre-modern age actually meant to use in order to gauge this? Like, are we the only people in Christian history, just in the modern age, where Christians can go ahead and actually gauge when someone's mentally ready? Did they not have the tools for 1700 years to actually assess this?
No, they didn't. Apparently, there were even Aquinas, this great person who who was aware that we should do morals based on natural, quote unquote, empirical facts, right? Was not aware of this, right? He obviously gets it wrong. The doctor of the church, right? The great metaethicist, right? The forefront of Catholic philosophy gets it wrong, right? And we'll see that even the church gets it wrong itself.
Scripture. Nature helps us to interpret Scripture. Scripture helps us understand nature. So Christians are called to learn from nature to better understand how human flourishing should be achieved. We're not just supposed to take arbitrary commands from the past and not apply them to modern standards, as well as our advances in science.
Sure. So I just got a quick syllogism here for you just on this topic. So
okay.
We can talk about first Jesus' lack of condemnation of said practices. Obviously, presumably, you would think that Jesus, as God, man, at the same time, he still has the knowledge accessible to him to know that these practices are wrong, right? So there's no appeal to he didn't have any access to this natural law not being optimal, and we've only now figured out now Jesus would have that knowledge, right? So premise one, Jesus followed some oral traditions evidenced by him celebrating Hanukkah in John 10, a practice that isn't written in the Old Testament. Do you agree?
Depends on Old Testament. Are you taking the Catholic one? Because it would be in Maccabees.
I mean, you don't really let your, as I know, like you don't let your denomination be known. So yeah. It's going to be like a whole holistic view. I mean, I'm not going to.
I'll just grant you that. I'll grant you that. Yeah, he's basically. Let me help you with a word. He's celebrating in a holiday that was not directly commanded by God,
sure.
Because it's not in the Torah, for example. The Purim, for example.
Okay, so yeah, he basically grants it, and I then make mention of Matthew 15. But before we get into that, was it indicated within the debate as sort of him granting that Jesus did adhere to some of the Pharisaic oral traditions, because he did grant this whole idea that Jesus celebrated Hanukkah. Isn't that an indirect way of him saying, yeah, like he would practice certain oral practices and he didn't condemn all of them? Wouldn't you say that's indirectly what's being said here?
Yeah, like as in he completely ignored some practices. He did not condemn them, even though they were bad, right?
Yeah, but also, you know what he says on his stream with Sig when he was reacting to the debate. He didn't express his view to me, but apparently his view is that Jesus condemned all oral practices. How is that the case? If he conceded
all oral
already?
Practices?
Yeah, from the Pharisees.
Yeah, that makes no sense. Like clearly, you mentioned like Hanukkah, right?
Yeah, I can pull up the clip.
But look, let us just hold on to this really quick. Right? I want to say one thing, right? If it was the case that he combated against oral practices, right? We see the Pharisees, they complained that he didn't wash his hands, right? They made a big fuss about that, right? And we see the Pharisees, at least in the New Testament, as far as I know, right? They make a big fuss about that, right? And we see the Pharisees, at least in the New Testament, as far as I know, right? They make a big fuss about that, right? And we see the Pharisees, at least in the New Testament, as far as I know, right? They make a big fuss about that, right? they were like big ops of Jesus. You know, they were like after him, like let's kill this person, right? So these people would have done anything to condemn him. They would have picked any look. They condemned him for that oral tradition, which means that either that oral tradition was widespread or it was accepted among the people as something to be done, right? And reason being is because it comes from the ancestors, or as the rabbinic Jews would claim, it was given at Sinai, right, as an oral law, as part of the Torah, as an infallible interpretation, right? Either of those would make the Pharisees condemn Jesus for it, which they did for not washing the hands, right? So if they had bigger things like, you know, if there were bigger issues, like I'm sure marriage is a bigger issue than washing hands, right? So they would definitely have condemned him. It seems theoretically probable and intuitive that they would have condemned him on this idea. I was like, hey, why are you disagreeing with us on this, right? Why are you like holding this opinion? They would have found any reason to condemn him, right? And we just don't see this. So like, why would we even hold to the idea that he was against all oral laws? Surely from what is probable here is that he accepted a lot of them and he rejected some of them, right? And presumably the ones that he rejected are, like, for example, the washing of the hands, right?
So premise 2, Jesus disapproved of certain oral practices of the Jews at his time, being Pharisees, shown in Matthew 15, where he explains how the Pharisees should stop washing their hands as an obligatory ritual prior to eating. You agree with that, correct?
Yeah, he condemned the traditions of the Pharisees, yes.
Sure. Premise 3, the Pharisees' oral tradition almost certainly maintained a tradition of girls being able to marry at the onset of puberty, which can be found in the earliest Jewish commentaries for Ezekiel 16.
Okay, keep going.
You agree?
No, but keep going, so finish your syllogism.
Okay. I mean, we have to stop there, so because it can't go on. Like,
okay, well,
if you dispute it.
So the reason I'm disputing it is because a lot of that's so prior to 70 AD, there were various different schools. I mean, you have Pharisees of Galilee, you have Pharisees of Judea, you have different classes of these different groups. All of that sort of like blended together after 70 AD when the Jews lost the temple and they just start working more together. Prior to that, there was a lot of different things. So you have like the Essenes, for example, disputing with the Pharisees, disputing with the Sadducees. Even Pharisee groups are not entirely always in agreement with each other. And a lot of what we have regarding the oral law is going to come after 70 AD in like places like the Mishnah. It's hard to really determine how far it goes back in terms of those type of things, or which group it would have been confronted with.
Okay. You have any evidence that contradicts that the minimum age of marriage was at the onset of puberty in these early times?
Yes, the research, as I said, by Andrew Trooper and Michael Satlow, show that in Palestine specifically, they're marrying between earliest is like mid-teens would be on average. So the general custom Jesus would have been seeing around then is not 12-year-olds getting married left and right. The general custom he would have been mostly aware of is girls marrying after 16, that kind of thing.
Sure, but would he be aware of a tradition that most likely would allow for young marriages that you would condemn, such as 11, 12, 13, 14, these sort of ages? He would be exposed to that.
He was
more than likely so.
So you're asking if he would be aware of these types of practices going on in Judea?
These practices being taught by the Pharisees as an oral law, as explained as for the exegesis of Ezekiel 16.
We don't know, did he come up in terms of what he would condemn? Now, he would have been aware in the sense in the Christian tradition he is God, but it was never actually brought to him as something to discuss.
Okay, sure. So, but he would be aware of these practices.
Possibly,
being taught, even if the practice wasn't happening.
Yeah, I was trying to make a distinction between it being practiced and it being taught. If the Pharisees are teaching this as part of what marriage like conditions have to be met, it doesn't matter if it's being practiced or not. What matters is the teachings that they're giving, right? Now, he will definitely be exposed to that, like undeniably. So he'll be exposed to what are the conditions for marriage, and can someone marry at the age of the onset of puberty, and so on and so forth. Like this is all clearly would be expressed around Jesus, and he would be around these Jews teaching this. And even he would even say that the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat to obey their teachings, right? And part of their teachings would be when someone is ready for marriage. Now, obviously, that includes the minimum condition being the onset of puberty.
Yeah. Is there fine if like I make like a short later on, like if you want me to make a commentary on what do I think there's like an inconsistency in him holding to moral naturalism with the idea of like what the church fathers have preached and what the how do you call it, like the the Bible preaches, as far as I understand it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like later on, if you don't mind, like a short 2-3 minutes like parenthesis.
Yeah, inshallah. Would you want to do it now or just a bit later?
Let's see if there's something like a more opportune time to like do this.
Okay, yeah, probably somewhere near the middle.
So a teaching that we have mentioned in the earliest. Okay, 1 second. I want to address what you said before. So you citing the average age of marriage being 18 to 20, 16 to 20. Okay, I grant that. That's not my claim. My claim is the minimum acceptable age being taught by these pre-modern societies was the onset of puberty. And to support my claim, we have Origin of Alexandria, right? Someone that you guys do take from a lot, that did progress a lot, like, in terms of how to articulate the Trinity. Origin of Alexandria commentates on Ezekiel 16 in the same manner as these Jews. He says that the onset of puberty is what's being discussed here in Ezekiel 16:8. So we have conformity from early church members. We have conformity between the Mishnah. You're not giving me any evidence to work with that contradicts what I'm posing.
Yeah, then finish what you're trying to posit so we can discuss it.
Okay.
Yeah, did he give any good justification on why we shouldn't rely upon these like early commentaries from these Pharisees? Like from
No,
from
it's
the
just
Mishnah,
they're
from the
wrong.
early-
They contradict the current empirical observations, which, by the way, empirical observations do not determine moral fact. Another argument against this moral naturalism is that, you know, presumably that which is identical to moral facts, right? Or that which is presumably immediately linked to moral facts, right? We would expect it to be found by people who study this, right? Like empiricists and whatnot, right? And there is not a single like consensus theory among modern day scientists that such and such is immoral and such is moral, right? It's more about this is what the laws of physics describe, and this is what, like, so on and so on. Yo, what's up? Yeah. Like I said, I noticed you.
Premise 4.
But yeah,
If
look,
getting married at the onset of puberty led to great harm.
Oh, sorry, did you want to go on?
yeah, no, I want to say, look, the point is like one issue is that, as I said, is if something is part of field X, right, we would presumably expect the experts in field X to discover about it, right? And we don't find anything, right? But let's grant that the scientists had a consensus theory that young marriages are immoral rather than young marriages have X and X consequence, right? Right? How does that contradict a fatherly opinion, or an interpretation of the New Testament, or what could have been a possible tradition within the culture of Jesus that was maybe, I don't know, given at Sinai by God according to the Jews, right? Or not? How would that contradict? It would only come with the assumption that, oh, whatever is moral has to be consistent with whatever my moral naturalistic theories have to teach, right? And I just don't think that's correct, right? Why like, is God, what if God wants to, I don't know, contradict like moral naturalism? What if he wants to make hold that something is immoral, which moral naturalism would hold as moral? Is God incapable of that, or is God forbidden to even wish that? If he was capable and he could wish that, I don't see any reason to hold this assumption that inherently there cannot be a conflict in between this moral naturalist ways of inferring morals and patristic prescriptions on morals, right? But if you drop this, then what is your argument for rejecting these fatherly opinions? Why do you reject, I don't know, all these people, like, right? Like, there seems to be no argument.
Harm to the extent where, sorry, 1 second, where it is a prohibited action, you would very much expect Jesus to condemn it, just as he condemned or practice that was introduced through human traditions of ritual washing before eating. Would you expect that?
Not necessarily, no. There's a lot of horrible practices going on in Jesus' day. He didn't have time to talk about because that's not what he was mainly focusing on. So, for example, we know,
example analogous to this.
Absolutely. So the Greeks had moved in throughout the region of Palestine. Basically, the Decapolis, for example, Tiberias, for example, on the Sea or Lake Galilee. We know that the Greeks and the Romans liked to use boys. That was a very common practice in that day, especially throughout the Roman Empire.
Sorry, just to cut you off. I'm aware of that. I forget the Greek term, but it's translated to corrupting boys, if I'm mistaken, right? So they were talking about that. The early church did condemn that as a practice.
The early church condemned it. You're talking about Jesus, though.
Yeah, even Jesus did not condemn it. That's correct. But the reason why I'm going to posit as to why he did not condemn it and why it's not analogous is because the immediate audience, when Jesus is condemning such things in oral practices, has to have some basis within the Mishnah or the oral tradition that we know of today, right? Now, the oral tradition of the Jews didn't posit this corrupting boys practice that you're citing. This is from the Greeks. This isn't from the Jews. This isn't from the Pharisees. So I would say this is analogous. Can you give another example?
No. You're talking about why did Jesus condemn all these practices going around in the world around him at that time? I mean,
not around the world. That'd be a straw man. I'm saying specifically the practices that he was exposed to that the Pharisees were teaching as oral law.
You're assuming they were teaching this like frequently, like this was just a common thing. It was probably.
Yeah, but like, why would it not be something that they would be teaching frequently? This is about marriage. Like, the Pharisees wouldn't be teaching about marriage. Like, what's he trying to say?
Again, as I said, marriage is very important. Marriage is definitely more important than washing your hands, right? But I want to say one thing, bro. Okay, his entire argument is that you'll see throughout the video there are harmful consequences to young marriages, right? And that might be in line with what that might be, maybe inferable from a general principle that Jesus teaches, which is that I think it's somewhat throughout Matthew 18:10. He says, "Be careful that you do not corrupt one of those little ones, for I can assure you that in heaven, each of their guardians always see their faces," right? Um, so I think there's multiple translation of that verse, but one of them says to harm, right? I'm not sure what the Greek says, but if it was to be the case that, you know, um, that's what the verse would say, right? But even if the verse didn't say that, presumably Jesus would care about what the little ones are suffering, right? What they're being harmed, right? He would care a lot about this evil, quote unquote, practice and immoral practice of young marriage, right?
This is a good inference as well, because now it's put into question, how do we understand what Jesus means by little ones? And you're gonna have to get that from the patristics, right? So that's a good, yeah, that is another good inference as well based upon that. Yeah, as you said, if he is concerned about the little ones and about harm induced to the little ones, if Jesus, again, this is going to be like another argument on why you would expect a condemnation here. Jesus talks about the early church and talks about how the disciples are going to carry on like with the Holy Spirit, and they're going to have the authority to teach the religion. If Jesus is concerned about harm to little ones, what about the millions of children that he knows will be harmed, essentially, as far as he's trying to say? And it's not even something that's detached from the church. Rather, it's something that's taught within the church itself, right? So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like my point was like, look, whether you want to translate the verse as harming little ones or misguiding them or whatever, there's two options. Either Jesus it can be clearly from the verse that he cares about little ones because he made an explicit case. Why did he not just say don't harm people or don't misguide people? He said don't misguide or do not harm or do not cause to stumble the little ones. So it shows that he does care about little ones, right? Specifically, he has an entire saying about that, right? And besides this, even if the verse was not understood this way and I could not make this inference, right? Presumably, he would care a lot about little ones, right? And he would see this practice causing harm and he would condemn it, right? He'd be like, hey, Pharisees, what is wrong with
GK,
you?
not even just seeing, but he's God as well, so he would know what would go on within the church for 1700 years.
Well, if one idea that I just got is that, a lot of Christians quote this sheep and like false prophet who's dressed like wolf as a sheep and whatnot, right? Referring to the prophets, Allahu Alaihi Wasallam, right? And they're saying, they're prophesizing our evil religion and whatnot, right? But God never brought up the quote unquote best argument against Islam, which is this famous controversial marriage, right? He never, this God here did not never produce this argument like, look, there's going to be this quote unquote evil man who's going to practice this evil practice, right? We should I should make some condemnation of this. I should be more clear, at least in my condemnation of young marriages and whatnot, right? He did not even think about this, right? But going back to what I wanted to say, right? It's either the case that the verse is going to be used to justify that, little ones shouldn't be harmed and that he had a special feeling for little ones, and hence we would expect more for him to condemn it, but he did not, right? Or is just assumed, right? Did you get what I'm going with this, or what I previously like,
Yeah, no, 100%. It's a valid point, and you would all of these conditions we're mentioning as to why you would expect. I also compound on this on the fact that I give like a sort of analogy, right? Even on the basis of misinterpretation of the Old Testament. Okay, if the Old Testament is being misinterpreted because according to him, the God of the Old Testament doesn't want pedophilia to occur, and his standard of pedophilia is like young marriages from like the age of puberty up until I don't know, the age of 15 or so. If the God of the Old Testament didn't make it clear and it left it ambiguous to the point where Jews for thousands of years were misinterpreting the Old Testament to allow for such action, then you would expect that Jesus, peace be upon him, would come with a teaching to clarify these misinterpretations. So this is like another compounding variable I add later on in the discussion. But he fails to address it. There's like so many reasons why you would expect, and the only reason why you wouldn't expect that he provides is, well, it wasn't as common, right? The practice itself wasn't as common, right?
If you don't mind, I would like to say add one short parenthesis.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so like you mentioned that, look, how do we know what little ones mean? Like we need to go to the church fathers, right? Going back to his rejection of the church fathers, which seems to be unjustified, right? Christians have to be called out, right, for this. Okay, I'm asking you, do you care about what church fathers have to say? It's either that you care or you don't, right? If you don't care, then just please do not hide behind it, right? Do not say that you do care. Do not act like a, sneaky Protestant, right? Like, just please be honest about it, right? Like, whether you're going to have your Catholic and other apostolic followers like leave, right? Just please be honest about it. Do not tell me that you respect fatherly opinion, patristic opinion, but then act like you don't. Because here's the thing: there's been like a lot of papers on like experts' testimony in science and epistemic authority, which is the field of how do we know when someone has the authority with respect to something, right? And a lot of theories have been advanced. For example, in hermeneutics, how do we understand scripture? Presumably, if I'm going to say that this church father is an epistemic authority with respect to access to true hermeneutical principles and inferences, right? Interpretation of scripture, I'm going to behave towards him in a way. I'm not going to say, oh, he's wrong, because modern scientists say, for example, if a church father says something, I'm not going to dismiss him on my authority, because that would mean that I am greater than him in interpretation, right? I'm not going to dismiss him so easily. Presumably, I would have to have a church father condemning him or something. I need to have a theory whereby which I dismiss these people so that I do not just randomly dismiss them arbitrarily, right? Presumably, I would want to say that, hey, this church father is wrong, and here's another church father that says the opposite, right? But nothing of such is provided. What is provided here is that, here's the thing: my name is Inspiring Philosophy. The church father is wrong because, he's just wrong, or because, he did not have access to these like empirical observations, right? I mean, this is not like a proper, I wouldn't see this a proper rejection, right? That is non-arbitrary or like of these things, right? Anyways.
Mm-hmm. And maybe try not to pause as much, because we haven't even got to like 20 minutes soon.
What frequency?
Yes,
Sorry,
it does, because you're just saying, well, Jesus didn't actually condemn child marriage or like marrying at 12. That's not really what the point of Christian ethics is. He's not going to give us an exhaustive list of every do and don't. Christianity, Jesus and Paul are laying down a system of virtue ethics. So if you read, for example, the Nicomachean Ethics from Aristotle, he doesn't list a lot of actions to perform, even though he's doing an ethical treatise, because that's not how ancient forms of ethics really work. You could list some actions, but that wasn't the aim. The aim is to basically teach imitation, lay down the virtues, this kind of stuff. So when you basically do that, right action will follow. It's not his aim at that point to literally give an exhaustive list of everything wrong the Pharisees are doing, or everything wrong the Greeks are doing. So there's a problem right then and there in terms of our assumptions.
Okay, I understand your position. This is a very modern approach to these sort of topics. This isn't like something that you would find within the early church then actually teaching in regards to this topic. Actually, the early church would know of a lot of harmful effects. As I'm going to get to my second argument, this is still my first one. They would have been aware of these harmful effects of children to even a greater extent, because they didn't have any access to medical facilities. The infant mortality rate would be a lot higher than today. The maternal mortality would be a lot higher than today. The complications such as fistulas that you bring up, obstetrical fistulas, would also be a lot higher than today, because of no medical facilities accessible to them back then, right? So they would be aware of all these major complications. And even if I grant your assumption that we had some virtue ethics that they used as a broad principle that they would apply, they would be the first people to condemn based upon this principle you posited, based on the harmful effects they would see coming about from child marriages, and yet they still don't.
What do you think about that point?
Can you repeat like that particular part? I wasn't fully on.
You're good.
Doing ethical treatise, because that's not how ancient forms of ethics really work. You could list some actions, but that wasn't the aim. The aim is to basically teach imitation, lay down the virtues, this kind of stuff. So when
Sorry?
I heard this part. Give it like a 10 seconds skip.
Everything wrong the Greeks are doing. So there's a problem right then and there in terms of our assumptions.
Okay, I understand your position. This is a very modern approach to these sort of topics. This isn't like something that you would find within the early church then actually teaching in regards to this topic. Actually, the early church would know of a lot of harmful effects. As I'm going to get to my second argument, this is still my first one. They would have been aware of these harmful effects of children to even a greater extent, because they didn't have any access to medical facilities. The infant mortality rate would be a lot higher than today. The maternal mortality would be a lot higher than today. The complications such as fistulas that you bring up, obstetrical fistulas, would also be a lot higher than today, because of no medical facilities accessible to them back then, right? So they would be aware of all these major complications. And even if I grant your assumption that we had some virtue ethics that they used as a broad principle that they would apply, they would be the first people to condemn based upon this principle you posited, based on the harmful effects they would see coming about from child marriages.
Pause this real quick. I'm gonna say this. So what you're arguing here is that, look, back then it would have been even worse. Yeah. All these
Mhm.
things, all these medical issues would have been much worse. Okay. If it would have been much worse, we would expect to see it more, right? And these obviously virtuous people, these obviously virtuous church fathers, church people, and whatnot, right, who have the virtuous ethics passed down, through apostolic tradition by Jesus, or just inferable through Protestant interpretation from the Bible, would have seen these disastrous, even more, amplified effects due to like the lack of modern science and medicine, and they would condemn it. But we don't even see that. So yeah, that's yet another theoretical reason to hold to why it would be probable to expect a condemnation, right? But then we don't expect it again. People will say that this is arguing from silence. No, no, no. It's like we look at some particular things, right? And we ascribe what we would expect from it, right? We might not have like a necessity relation whereby which we infer that given this, then this will happen. No, we will look at it, we will theorize what we might expect, right? But that's not necessary, right? But is that really arguing from silence? No, that's like probabilistically, I would expect, if this is a good way to argue from consequence. People before, also Christians before, would also argue
Mhm.
in this way, right?
Mhm.
But if they would argue in this way and there was a much more amplified effect and disaster because lack of science, lack of medicine and whatnot, we would expect them to use this argument to much better, this line of reasoning to much better degree than inspiring philosophy, and find condemnation of it, right, in these virtuous church fathers. But again, none of them. Yeah.
Mhm.
They still don't condemn it. The early church still don't. So who are you to condemn it today based upon the findings you find from obstetrical fistulas and the rates of maternal mortality rates? Who are you to make that decision then based on virtue ethics that it's more harmful, even though they were exposed to even more harm back then?
Okay, so two things. First of all, Brent Shaw, his book, his paper, The Age of Roman Girls at Marriage and Some Considerations. No, Christians were actually marrying later than the average pagan Roman was. So they were already.
That has nothing to do with the prohibition. It has to do with the ideal nature of getting married later on. It has nothing to do. Yeah, again, we're still dealing with what Christians were. Maybe Christians wanted to marry at a more optimal range, but that has nothing to do with the prohibition of younger marriages. Rather, they're just moving away from less optimal marriages, right?
Parenting practices around that time where they were not actually marrying around the same time as the Romans were. So they probably, for them in their culture, they were already expecting girls to wait longer. And again, if the average age girls were marrying in this time is still late teens, they're not seeing it as frequently. They'd already determined as culture, hey guys, based on stuff like what Cyrannus of Ephesus says, that young girls should not be bearing children because they're just simply not ready. They can't actually get the child out of them for various reasons. So you're assuming, like, for example, that there was this widespread use of it going around, and that's just not necessarily.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's widespread or not. The knowledge itself of young marriages would be evident. And he quotes Cyrannus of Ephesus to show that they had this knowledge, therefore they were delaying marriage. Okay, if they had this knowledge to the effect where they would delay marriage, why isn't there the implementation of prohibition? He's not addressing that.
The case. Second of all, I go back to the book of scripture and the book of nature. The more we learn about this, the more it's likely we can say, yes, this is extremely harmful and we should condemn it. And early church fathers would agree with that kind of stuff about studying nature to determine what is likely, to determine how we should understand what is going to be the most optimal way of human flourishing. So of course I can condemn it based on what scientific research has shown.
Can I touch
the
on
reason
this
modern
really
science turns out of Christian Europe, as scholars like Toby Huff.
Yep.
Yeah. So what I would like to do is this, right? If you give me exactly like about like 5 seconds, I'll find some yeah, there you go. So there's some verses in the New Testament that obviously I might not have the best interpretation, but they would seem to me, apparently, as a layman, to contradict what he's saying, right? So read in verses like Mark 7, Mark chapter 7, verse 5 through 8, he says, so the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders? Right? What does this show? It shows that he was expected to live through that, right? Then it says, instead of eating their food with defiled hands, he replied, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you, hypocrites, at its statement, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. And what does Jesus say after? They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. So it seems that Jesus is condemning the human reasoning or the human origination of these type of rules. And then he says, you have let go of the commandments of God and are holding on to human traditions. Okay. Now, what does he say? You have let go of the commandments of God. It seems that Jesus is espousing that, morality and what is commanded has to come from God, right? Then he says in Matthew chapter 15, verse 9, he says the same thing. He says, they worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. Okay. But then we also see, Colossians chapter 2, verse 8, because he mentions Aristotle a lot, right? He says, see to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human traditions and the elemental spiritual forces of this world rather than Christ. So again, it seems that the people back then would make inferences based on like spirits and whatever natural observations they would have, right? And he says, what did he say? He says, and the elemental spiritual forces of this world rather than on Christ, right? Now, my interpretation on these verses might not be the best, right? Which is why what I prefer to do is like look at the church fathers, which again I might be faulty on them, but I would like to read like a quote from Hilary of Poitiers on De Trinitate. It's book 7, right? And the person says, for it is right that we who declare that Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God should not flee from the doctrines of men, but rather overthrow them. Again, clear condemnation of like human reasoning and whatnot, right? To these morals and whatnot. We also see in the first epistle of Clement, chapter was it like 11, right? He says, and they will receive judgment because of their talkativeness and their frivolous teachings. They teach natural wisdom and the frivolous error of the plausible words of wisdom of man, according to the will of the prince of dominion of the air, and of the spirit which works of those men who will not obey according to the training of this world, and not according to the doctrine of Christ. Seems like to be an explicit condemnation of appeal to natural things, right? And you know what's interesting? He mentions the prince of the dominion of the air, which presumably is Satan, right? I think Paul says somewhere that, Satan is the god of this world, right? The god of, this is what we observe around, right? If you want, I can send you these quotes if you're interested, like with the link and whatnot. Like you have them right now on Discord. I send them to you if you want to open it for the people to see. Um, you know, or later
So
on, like people can,
our okay,
What
one
do you think
second.
about this thing that I've leveled here?
Yeah, I think there's a good case to be made here. On how his whole methodology just contradicts scripture. Sorry, one second. Let me pull these quotes up. Or how about I would just put the links in the comment section. I'll put it in the description as
Yeah, I
well.
think you should do that with the quotes and whatnot.
I'll put the links in the description as well, inshallah. All right, while I do that, I'll keep playing it.
I think you can do this later. Like you can add them to the video and whatnot, right?
Oh, sorry. I thought I was playing the video.
Yeah, no
okay.
issues. I cannot see anything. By the way, my point was just to say that it seems that Jesus and the church fathers are condemning appealing to natural wisdom and philosophy, such as looking at the natural effects, the spiritual forces. Back then, they would just even natural events they would consider spiritual forces back then, right? Which is but yeah, I think the first episode of Clement and Hilary of Poitiers and the New Testament explicitly talk about and condemn people who do not get their morality from the commandments of God, right? Presumably, what is immoral, God would condemn you to not do it. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Because
yeah, go ahead.
here's one thing I want to say really quick, right? So if we can get morals from science, okay, that's one thing. Let's grant that. Let's say we have a perfect system to get moral from science. Now, what is immoral? Would that be condemned? Would that really be condemned? Are there like extra commandments? Is there more to Christianity than the sacraments and the love of Jesus and faith, right? Is sola fide just thrown apart? Because presumably what is immoral, we would see God telling us to not do it. Yeah. But then we would have extra commandments. So we would see we would see the sola fide position in danger. Like if you look at this I think this entire condemnation of young marriages from the Christian standpoint, at least even from a Protestant stance, would require like at least prima facie, right? You would see a lot of inconsistencies, right? Like I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think yeah, just intuitive that whatever is being practiced at the day and age, or what's being taught by the Pharisees, would be deemed okay unless Jesus would suggest otherwise, right? So unless you would expect otherwise, honestly, especially considering all the sources you brought up, why we would have to appeal to the source of something outside of scripture, something outside of tradition that would give us that like moral appeal.
Just want to get to the end of my syllogism after this, if you don't mind. So yeah, if we can talk about your first point, which is you're having your cake and you're having your cake and you're eating at the same time, because you're telling me, whatever his name is, Cyrannus of Ephesus, I believe, he gives a descriptive account of these harmful effects and how people that are young have these complications from childbirth. So they're aware of the complications. Like we're not like coming across anything in the modern age that they didn't know of. If you're going to maintain that position, then be consistent and know that the early church did know the harmful effects, and based upon the harm principle that they had to apply to certain marriages, as I would assume they would like condemn certain marriages that would cause intense harm, such as getting married too old, having relations with someone that's too old is going to cause intense harm. So the early church would condemn such a thing, right? They would condemn also. Yeah, wait, I know it's an argument from silence, but it's an argument from silence aren't inherently fallacious. If you expect it to be evidence, then it's not fallacious, right? You agree. Now I'm making a case that you would expect it to be evidence. I want to finish. Now, when we're talking about the early church and Cyrannus of Ephesus or other like early people that you mentioned, I remember that you did mention during your responses, you're having your cake and you're eating, as I said, because you're saying these people knew of these harmful effects, but at the same breath you're saying that they didn't condemn it due to them being ignorant of the harmful effects. That's being inconsistent. Now the second thing you mentioned.
No. That's not what I'm saying.
I love you. You're just gonna have to let me finish. I let you finish, and I want to reply to all your points, right?
But yeah, what do you think about that point I made about him like having his cake and he's eating it at the same time?
I didn't quite get that point, but what is interesting is how he went quickly on asserting that it's an argument from silence, right? Again, good response, right? We do expect there to be evidence, right? We have a high probability, a theoretical probability for there to be evidence, right? We would expect condemnation, we would expect like anything, right? Like we don't see any of this, right? So it's not arguing from silence, right?
The point basically on having his cake and he's eating at the same time. He's saying in one breath they knew of the harmful effects, so they delayed the marriage. They delayed the marriages at their time. But at the same breath, he's saying they didn't know the harmful effects. That's why they never prohibited it. That's why you didn't see the early church prohibiting it. So that's the inconsistency.
Oh wow. Okay. I see. That's crazy. I didn't catch that. That's crazy.
I mean, we can replay it if you want, because he literally says this. 1 second.
Relations with someone that's too old is going to cause intense harm. So the early church would condemn such a thing, right? They would condemn also. Yeah, wait. I know. That's
used to it going around, and that's just not necessarily the case. Second of all, I go back to the book of Scripture and the book of nature. The more we learn about this, the more it's likely we can say, yes, this is extremely harmful, and we should condemn it. And early church fathers would agree with that kind of stuff about studying nature to determine what is likely, to determine how we should understand what is going to be the most optimal way of human flourishing. So of course I can condemn it based on what scientific research has shown. That's a Christian tradition. There's a reason modern science comes out of Christian Europe, as scholars like Toby Huff or Edward Grant have noted. It's because Christians were very much interested in studying nature to determine.
Yeah, I'm so interested in seeing the evidence for this. I'm so interested in seeing a single church father that holds that, morality is inferable from, natural facts, right? I'm interested in seeing this. And then what I'm also interested in seeing is, why is he not wrong? Just like the church fathers you presented, they're wrong. Why is that church father, which presumably, exists according to him because he espouses his existence, someone, early Christian who held to that, right? We don't even know if he does, right? But if he does, why is that person not wrong, right? Like, well, in what way qualitatively, without like, what is the symmetry breaker that establishes why exactly his church father that espouses his entire foundational theory by which he justifies a lot of his arguments isn't wrong, but the church father that you provided, or the church fathers, public, right? Plural, are wrong.
And what right actions were to take to determine the laws God has imputed in the universe, this kind of thing. So of course I can condemn it based on what the research has. Now, in terms of what happens in the past, I could just simply apply the idea of presentism. They didn't know, for example, but that doesn't mean they're making a moral action at that point, because again, they had lacked the information to be able to determine the moral status of the situation.
I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that.
Yeah, so they lack the information. I'm trying to find the clip because you mentioned Cyrannus. Where was it?
It's more harmful, even though they were exposed to even more harm back then.
Okay, so two things. First of all, Brent Sean is both his paper, The Age of Roman Girls at Marriage and Some Considerations. No, Christians were actually marrying later than the average pagan Roman was. So they were already experiencing practices around that time where they were not actually marrying around the same time as the Romans were. So they probably, for them in their culture, they were already expecting girls to wait longer. And again, if the average age girls were marrying in this time is still late teens, they're not seeing it as frequently. They'd already determined as culture, hey guys, based on stuff like what Cyrannus of Ephesus says, that
There we go. So based upon what Cyrannus of Ephesus and what the early Christians were already doing, they were delaying the age of marriage because they knew of the harmful effects. But in the same breath before, as we just heard, he's saying, oh, the reason why you don't see condemnation, despite them having this
Because
methodology.
they didn't know. Yeah,
Because
no,
they
that's
didn't
like
know,
an open contradiction, right? As you said, he's trying to like yeah, he can.
Like,
You have to
Paul,
hold to
mentioned
only one thing.
that this is immoral. Now, you would assume that these young marriages are more common than homosexual practices. So I still have a case to be made here that you would expect a condemnation. I'm going to respond now, but I want to get to the rest of my syllogism after your clarification.
Okay, clarify. I'm not saying that, hey, they were aware of these things, but they were also ignorant. I'm saying certain people like Tertullian, who is a legal scholar or theologian, he's not writing about these kinds of stuff. He's mainly focusing on Trinitarian aspects or dealing with heresies. He mentions it sort of like in brief passing kind of thing. Okay, he's not going to be a medical expert. So, and again, so his main focus.
You need to be a medical expert to know what the minimum age of marriage is in your society. Like what?
Is not even going to be on these kinds
First
of
of
things.
all,
He's more
that's
interested
a
in the
legal term. Real quick, right? Well, minimal age of marriage is going to be a legalistic term. That's under the jurisdiction of like people who are, experts in law, right? Law has nothing to do with morals, by the way, right? And law has nothing to do with what is natural. Law has with what societies decide upon, right? Three different fields, I think, again, mixed up into one. Again, like a lot of collapsing is done here between major fields of, morality, law, and what is natural, right? I think
Even if
science
we grant, even if we
Mm.
grant like this whole idea of like, okay, Tertullian was ignorant on the science, sure, but he's not espousing a minimum age of marriage that just comes from his own opinion. Obviously, the determining factors of why they would legislate within at his time the minimum age being 12 or the age of puberty, it would be dependent upon these experts during that time period or the experts during the like. Does he not think there's any competent scientists or competent legislators of law or competent sociologists within the early church for 1700 years? Like they were just talking about the Trinity and like theological matters bereft of any of these like fields. Like were they just like totally ignorant of these things? It doesn't make much sense.
So it's like wondering why, for example, like Richard Dawkins didn't mention Herbert Hoover, the president from like the 1920s and 30s. Well, it's just not a topic he's focusing on. It's a similar kind of thing when it comes to Tertullian. Now, you're true, he does mention something in passing about veiling around the age of 12, but again, he's not going to be an expert on this. We got to go to someone like Cyrannus of Ephesus. It'd be like me studying Macrobius. Macrobius says monarchy did not happen until the age of 14, but he was a philosopher. Should I use him?
Sure. So if you're making an isolated case with Tertullian, you have a point, I guess, kind of. But with a holistic view of my argument, I'm not resting my case on Tertullian. We've got Origen, Tertullian, Aquinas, canon law in the Catholic Church, setting it at 12 years old, with exceptions being made if they reach monarchy earlier. I'm giving you these holistic cases. Are you going to say all these people were ignorant? That they did, like, none of these people have access to what Cyrannus of Ephesus had said? Is it like just one isolated guy in history that had access to this information? I'm sure these guys knew, the early church knew for 1,700 or 1,800 years, they knew of these harmful effects, and yet never condemned it on based on the principle of harm. So it's going to get kind of repetitive now. So maybe I can just finish and then we can get to
One question. So with canon law, it says marriage, right? It says minimal is marriage, right? Okay, so like you read Ken Phillips' book, Medieval Maidens, they arrange marriages early, but often they put a stipulation saying you can't consummate until they're in their late teens. For obvious reasons.
Were you allowed to consummate at 12?
Not necessarily, because of the problems that would result that Albertus Magnus Gallus of Rome would talk about. So canon law just seems to be like, hey, this is like the bare minimum, but people of the actual time knew consummation should not actually be happening at that age. That's why they didn't actually assume that was the case.
12 wasn't the bare minimum. They make exceptions to this, just as Aquinas did. Aquinas had canon law in his day. He didn't contradict canon law. And in Aquinas' Summa, he says a girl is ready at 12, a boy is ready at 14, and a girl can be ready before 12 even if she meets the requirements. So that's not true.
Okay, well, quite frankly, he's just simply wrong. That's why I go to medical experts of his day to show
You're throwing them all under the bus. Like this is
Yeah.
like
what's wrong with that. They can be wrong. They're not infallible.
What's wrong with that? Throwing 1700 years worth of tradition under the bus.
That's what's interesting is that there's this thing called Aristotelian Thomistic jurisprudence. He appealed to Aristotle, right? And there's this person called Rene Wormser. He says Grecian service in assembling and coordinating the mass of canon law was of inestimable value, but the man to whom the church and canon law are most indebted is Saint Thomas Aquinas, right? And it's largely based upon the thesis of Saint Thomas Aquinas that the church jurist went so far, right? He says this in in his book Story of the Law, page 187 to 188. you know,
Okay,
going against the
so
Aquinas is
they're not
crazy.
completely ignorant of the harmful effects that this causes. They're not. What do you think these guys are doing? Like, they have no knowledge at all of what pregnancies are going around in their life. They know that younger girls have more harmful or they have more disadvantages when they're given pregnancy, just as they would know that older pregnancies would have more harmful effects. Surely they would know that. Like, what you're positing, I wouldn't expect. I would expect what I'm positing. To be fair, so
not necessarily. Like, for example, I respond to
I'm
people all
not
the
saying
time.
necessarily. I'm not saying necessarily. I'm making an inductive case on a probabilistic framework that you'd expect what I'm saying more than you.
Okay, well, I will respond to that by saying there's a lot of, like, for example, legal experts today who are whizzes at, like, legal issues, and yet their understanding of, like, medieval history is crap. I just had to respond to a guy who knows all about economic history, but he thinks, like, the Dark Ages was a thing. He thinks, like,
It's so many.
like the church was, like, persecuting scientists, and I just no, this is just simply wrong. Thomas Aquinas is not a medical expert. Often we can see in today's day where people that are, like, experts in, like, their niche make really bad assumptions about stuff in other niches. So Thomas Aquinas is not the guy to go to on this.
Would the church at some of Aquinas have medical knowledge, at least to a basic extent, to know that young marriages causes harm? Would the church at this time know this?
With the church or Aquinas? Who are you talking about?
Church, I'm not making. Listen, you keep strawmanning. I'm not making the case that Aquinas himself or Tertullian himself in these isolated cases are my evidence. They're making claims. They're making claims based upon norms at their times and beliefs at their times that were commonplace. So the early church at their times, at Aquinas' time, at Tertullian's time, at Origen's time, they would already have knowledge of older pregnancies or younger pregnancies having these higher harmful effects, and they were just positing what the general knowledge was at the time. They weren't saying anything that contradicted what was common belief in their societies, and common belief in their societies would include basic medical knowledge that younger pregnancies cause more harm. I mean, if you're going to say, sorry, just give me a minute, sorry.
Go ahead. Are you there?
Yeah, I think I got a. Oh yeah, my internet cut out at that point.
Zero. He's got to take care of something.
You know what's interesting?
Yep.
I'm not sure if so I think that the Catholic Church might hold that their canon law is, like, inspired by God, right? Or
I got it here. I got it here from the Council of Trent. There's a council where they actually say that if anyone says that the church could not establish impediments to dissolving marriage, or that she has erred in establishing them, let him be anathema. Part of the impediments is impediments of age. This is the Council of Trent.
Right. So then his opinion is anathema.
And I mentioned this to him later on in the debate, that he can't be a Catholic with this view. He doesn't like. He's very sneaky with it because he doesn't like that his denomination be known.
Right. So, like, the Catholic Church would hold that, you know, its moral prescriptions, specifically with marriage, right, are completely, you know, they're not wrong. If they're wrong, the Catholic Church is wrong. Therefore, this type of arguments is out of the way and inaccessible to Catholics, right? That's crazy. Making an entire argument and positing it like some, you know, like, obviously he wants to present this as a good argument against Islam. Ultimately, he wants to expand on this, and the idea that the biggest Christian denomination, which holds for at least 50 to 60% of the Christian world, would have to be false for this type of line of reasoning to work. I don't see how this is Christian anymore, right? How is it that more than half of the Christians of the world have to be in a misguided and false church, right, which gives false prescriptions as inspired by God, or that cannot be wrong, or that if you go against them, you're anathema, right? Like, is this really a cost that he wants to take? Obviously, throughout this video, you'll see that he is very sneaky, as you said, right? He doesn't want to accept this, right? Because this will be a huge blow. Not only would it just, you know, hurt the Catholic followers that he has, but it will hurt the entirety of his argument, because how can something be Christian, a Christian argument, or consistent with Christianity, and yet oppose the majority of Christians or the largest establishment of Christianity, the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church?
Let me find the comments.
Continue. No, you're good. Yeah. So, sorry, I had to, because I got my notes here in front of me on my PC, and for some reason the internet's disconnected. But yeah, so if you just allow me to continue my syllogism, because right now we're just at a disagreement. Like, I'm positing that the early church didn't have this basic knowledge that.
Finish your syllogism, and then I want to respond to a bunch of other stuff.
Okay. So I'll just repeat the premise I said just before, which is, if getting married at the onset of puberty led to great harm to the extent where it should be prohibited, or it should be a prohibited action, you would very much expect Jesus to condemn it, just as he condemned the oral human traditions of ritual washing before eating. Premise 5. Jesus did not condemn such a practice in the Bible or in the form of an oral tradition transmitted to the apostles in the early church, who had the best idea of what Jesus' morals were. On the contrary, they allowed such marriages, examples being Origen, Tertullian, Aquinas, and the majority of canon law in Catholic Church. Conclusion 1. Conclusion 1. If the level of harm for early or late pregnancies is high enough for prohibition, then one must expect. Sorry, no, that's the wrong one. My bad. Yeah, there we go. So Jesus almost certainly. So this is the first conclusion from the first syllogism. Jesus almost certainly did not believe marriages at the onset of puberty is immoral, and therefore Christians should find no problem with marriages like these occurring in pre-modern times. Go ahead.
Okay. A lot of philosophical issues there. Let me back up a little bit. So it wasn't the common practice in the medieval period. And Thomas Aquinas was a monk. He's not going to be an expert on this stuff. He's focusing on philosophy, these kinds of things. So again, medical experts of the day, as I already mentioned, said that it should be delayed until late teens, like 16 or 18. Okay, and again,
Wait,
the idea of
hold
common
on.
practice is simply false. I have so many sources here saying that throughout the minute.
Wait, hold on. Didn't he praise Aquinas as as like an originator of like these ethics, like these natural natural law ethics or natural ethics theory or whatever was it, and that he knows that that's how we should do it. But now Aquinas, you're wrong. Wait, what? Like, this was something that I talked about like couple like 15 minutes into prior to this moment within the video, right? You know what I mean? Like, I talked about this, like we would arrive at this point where he affirms Aquinas and then he dismisses it on the very same topic. Anyways,
Middle Ages or the medieval period, they're marrying around 20. I mean, it's just, I got a bunch. I've cited them in so many other videos in the past. That's just what it was. Your argument is an argument from silence. Okay, we know there's many things Jesus did not condemn that Christians later had problems with. That doesn't at all mean that this would be a problem. Because again, you're assuming this was like a in-your-face kind of thing. They came to Jesus with various customs or traditions of the Pharisees and said, what about this? What about that? Just because they never got to that one doesn't mean that he would have had a problem with it. This is assuming way too much from very limited data here. And that's just simply not how ethics works. You just can't build your entire case on an argument from silence. Because you could say the same thing about so many other practices, like female circumcision, which is a practice that did happen quite often in the ancient world. Or using the voice for what was that?
Did the Pharisees teach these practices that you're citing as examples?
No, but he engaged with Greeks for the similar reasons. John the Baptist, for example, condemned Herodias, with Herodias, for example.
Yeah,
so they were aware of certain practices and they condemned them when they saw them.
Yeah, so you like that for a second. Just repeat that point.
So, for example, John the Baptist condemns the marriage of Herod Antipas and Herodias, your brother's wife kind of thing. So when these things came up, I could just simply appeal to the fact this wasn't coming up in Jesus' day because most of them were getting married in the late teens or early 20s. So there wasn't this rampant problem of 12-year-olds marrying and having children and then dying from having, not when a birth cannot fully develop kind of issue. So this is just appealing to just an idea that just simply wasn't like rampant in Jesus' day or in his area.
Okay. Just to clarify, like nowhere in my syllogism that I actually mentioned it being commonplace, so that's a straw man yet again. Like, okay, you should try to.
I know you didn't say it. I'm responding by pointing out that it wasn't common, therefore it didn't come up. Therefore, we have a reason as to why we have silence on this from Jesus. So I know you didn't mention common. I didn't strawman you. That was my counter argument. Don't strawman me.
Yeah. So it being commonplace or not commonplace has nothing to do with the matter that it did.
I keep making like a cumulative case with like other aspects on why you would expect evidence. His only reason as to why you wouldn't expect evidence of Jesus actually prohibiting this is, well, it wasn't so common back in those times. Like,
it take place in the form of a teaching that the Pharisees were giving, right? Now,
hey, listen, as I said, like presumably, as I said at the somewhere around the beginning, right? Like, that would be such a great argument against, like such a good refutation of this evil religion called Islam, right? With this evil prophet, right? Like this wolf in sheep clothing, which that's such an evil thing, such a controversial marriage. Like, why would Jesus like come in as a hero to condemn this? Why would we not see this? That would have been such a beautiful story, right? But sadly, we weren't offered this. Anyways.
Yeah, and another thing, that's actually a good point. Like, when we talk about like good fruits and bad fruits, the Christians weren't equipped and actually, because let's say we're talking from the Christian perspective, right? The Prophet ﷺ has bad fruits because he married Aisha so young, right? May Allah be pleased with her. Okay, he has bad fruits, and now how do you dictate what is bad fruits and good fruits? Well, that's dictated by what Jesus has shown what's good actions and bad actions. But Jesus didn't equip the early Christians with the ability to actually determine what is good fruits and bad fruits in this aspect of, according to them, pedophilia, which would inhibit their application of the criteria Jesus gave them, because they wouldn't be able to actually tell that marrying someone so young is a bad fruit, right? Already now can we see that? So it even puts into question, like, how do you determine what's a good fruit and bad fruit? And it puts into question the criteria that Jesus gave them wasn't sufficient for 1,000+ years, right?
Yeah, no, he preferred to engage in polemics with the Pharisees.
Within the oral practices of the Pharisees, it more than likely was the case. If it more than likely was the case that they allowed it married so young, then you would expect Jesus to condemn such a human or oral tradition. Now, I'm going to posit other evidences. Like, for example, I know you didn't take the Protoevangelium of James, but despite that, it still serves a purpose of giving us a historical idea of what was the minimum acceptable age. Now, whether you want to take that Mary was 12 or not, the fact of the matter is Jesus is exposed to young marriages based on this historical evidence. Girls were getting married at the ages of 12 and 13, marriages that you see as having harmful effects. And we have so much historical data on this that shows that this was acceptable, this was occurred, despite it not being common. Another point would just be that we do see, despite other things not being common, condemnations like homosexuality. If you have a homosexuality, I would assume you would say that younger marriages were happening at a more frequent rate than the natural homosexual relations, right? Now,
Probably not.
it makes come on, come on. Okay, it's fine. Like, you can hold to that view. I'm going to
Not in the
disagree.
Greco-Roman world. Homosexuality was just a thing. Going through Greece, like you go to Corinth, for example, that was just a thing. But again, if you've already acknowledged that the average age they were marrying is late teens, early 20s, no, homosexuality has been far more common in that day and age than like marrying at 12.
Yeah, I disagree. And another point would be that there needs to be clarification on this due to the fact that the Jews are interpreting the Old Testament as allowing for a minimum age of marriage at such young ages. This would even it would give more credence to my view that you would expect there to be some condemnation based upon the misinterpretation or ambiguity being presented by the Old Testament, which are causing the Jews to interpret it in a manner that is causing all of these minor marriages to occur. So that would give more credence that you would expect it to be evidence, you would expect it to be condemnation from Jesus, right? It's like someone interpreting the Old Testament for thousands of years that homosexuality is allowed, and Jesus comes about and is clarifying all the mistakes, all the issues of the Jews, and yet he chooses to ignore that pressing matter that homosexuality isn't actually allowed, and they are misinterpreting the scripture, they're adding human traditions. So yeah, I mean, there's my argument. You disagree and you get your reasons why, but I don't want to dwell too much on one specific argument. I want to get to all the details from your responses, and yeah, so
okay, but we need to actually talk about something very important here. Okay, a
Really
lot of
quick,
people
if
in
you
the
don't
ancient
mind.
world were messed up. That's just
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to clarify with my contention, right? So as I said, right, granting everything, right, morals, whatever his morals are, right? Now the question is, presumably what is immoral has to be condemned, and we're commanded not to do it, correct? Presumably, right?
Mhm.
Right. We would expect everything that is immoral to be condemned against, right? Now, if it's the case that Jesus condemns people for not getting their commandments directly from God, but from natural wisdom, from vain philosophy, or from tradition of man, or from creatures, then it seems that Jesus only sees these commandments as, commandments and prohibitions, and, what we should do and what we shouldn't do, these things as coming only from God. Then, we would also expect morals are coming only directly from God and not through naturalistic inferences, right? Or else we can just make up commandments based on, what nature says and whatnot, right? But yeah.
going to be a fact because, again, the Romans and the Greeks just used children for all sorts of horrible things, especially sexual things. So a lot of people were suffering from mental issues. Poor nutrition is going to also result in poor mental issues. So a lot of the times, people of the ancient world just simply were not well off like we are today. That doesn't mean that if these rare early marriages were occurring, they were not resulting in harmful effects. And again, the systematic reviews, the narrative reviews today show child marriage leads to extreme harm, like higher rates of psychiatric disorders, depression, higher levels of stress. Okay, this is just a fact of nature. Brains are basically the same as they were 2,000 years ago. And if you put a child in a relationship where she is going to be having sex early before her temporal lobes are fully developed, okay, she is not going to develop and function naturally or in a good way. That needs to be acknowledged. So science is a very important aspect in this conversation because it directly shows this is harmful, even if the ancient people didn't realize it as much because they were having all sorts of horrible other things they were dealing with, like war and famine and disease.
So he's making the claim now that like we wouldn't expect them to notice these mental harms because they were going through war, famine, and so on, right? so because they're going through a bunch of other harms, they weren't able to detect that pedophilia was rampant in their societies. Like what?
They were too busy.
How's even an argument?
You know what's interesting?
More nutrition.
Hold on one second. Now, bro, so basically, wait, what? Is his system of morality something that we discover through time? Because clearly he's arguing that these people were ignorant of it. And so many people, so look, if morality is tied to natural observations, right, then we would only know about morals insofar as we have those natural observations. If we don't have them, we wouldn't have those morals, right? So presumably we would be committing bad things without knowing they're bad. Despite having scripture and have read it 100 times, we would still not know it's bad.
Yeah,
because we would have to experience something to infer that it is bad. Now the issue with this is that would God really be okay with this, right? Would God really be okay with us having our moral epistemology to be on some form of evolution path where we discover morals? Like there's some Pokemons that we grab with experience. Each experience is going to give us some new fact about morals, or like, oh, unlocked fact about morals. It's evil to do X because, I don't know, this has Y and Z harm. What? Like, that's crazy.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not gonna respond to that. So I already made my position clear as to why you would expect. Actually, whether you would expect condemnation by Jesus or not. So that's yeah, can you not hear me?
You kind of like went out for a second.
Okay, yeah. Yes. So you did not hear anything I said at all?
No, not really. It was like a 5 second gap.
Okay, so what I was saying was I'm not going to respond to the claims that was being made because it just rests upon whether you expect Jesus to condemn it or not. Really, like this is what this argument rests upon. I made the case you would expect. You made the case that you think you wouldn't expect. I'll leave up to the audience now to determine whether they would expect such a condemnation or not. So we can continue. Actually, before we continue the next argument, I want to see because I have heard before you claim that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is a pedophile, if I'm not mistaken. Did you make that claim?
If you're marrying a 9-year-old and consummating a marriage, well, married at 6 and consummated at 9, that would qualify as a non-exclusive pedophile that way.
Sure. So did Aquinas have in mind that such marriages are allowed?
At 9?
Younger than 12.
From what I can remember of what he said is that he would have allowed it, but there's like circumstances that would kind of go along with that. But again, I don't really care. Aquinas can just simply be wrong about that.
Sure, he's wrong, but I want to see if you'll be consistent with the entailment. So if someone consummated before the age of 12, meaning someone that reaches physical and mental maturity that is required for marriage preceding the age of 12, according to Aquinas, would that person be classified as a pedophile? And if yes, you're going to have to say yes to be consistent. I mean, that's something to be consistent. Then Aquinas, a doctor of the Catholic Church, is teaching that pedophilia is allowed.
Okay. Yeah, he's wrong about that. So what? Yeah, we don't have.
Yeah.
Wow.
You know,
He wants to hide. He wants to hide what that entailed, right? What does that entail, dude?
but like the fact of the matter is, when I asked him about Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, like in an instant he was ready to condemn it and ready to say it's, you know, pedophilia. Well, the moment I mentioned Aquinas, I gotta like drag it out of him for like 5 whole minutes, right? And what this means is that for 1700 years, the church is teaching that pedophilia is okay. The church that is meant to be the source of theology and morality is giving us an immoral action to be deemed moral for 1700 years. That's just crazy. Like, I don't, when you talk about what is your source of morality, or what's something you can depend upon for your religion and your ethics, the first thing would be obviously the institutions, right? And the traditions that were passed down from the earliest people. If you're going to say that the earliest people had, for example, we'll be bringing this up, you know, they didn't preach the Trinity, they got that wrong. That's one aspect of, you know, there being an issue. But on another aspect, them being wrong on like fundamental moral issues that, you know, would constitute extreme harm and would warrant prohibition from Jesus himself, and yet they get that extremely wrong. Like, what else are they extremely wrong on that maybe science could find in future? Like, it opens doors to all of these aspects.
But hold on, Dean. This might not just be an argument against Catholicism, because look, the church got it wrong. Damn, the church, bro, the infallible church, the Catholic Church, got it wrong. Again, this just dismisses any form of, this is not a Catholic friendly argument, right? I think this has been clear. But besides that, right, isn't there a notion in Christianity that there's at least a community of people or an establishment that is infallible, the Church of Jesus, where the gates of Satan will never prevail? Sure, some Catholics will interpret that to be towards the Catholic Church, but surely there must be some form of establishment that is continuously infallible. And that establishment, you know, since moral facts are, you know, some moral facts are not inferable from theological data, but rather from naturalistic facts, then if that establishment does not have access, you know, does not have modern science and whatnot to those like naturalistic facts, then that establishment itself, which is presumably infallible, you know, could teach, you know, false teachings because it doesn't have the knowledge, you know, or else it would just have to refrain from teaching anything moral outside of what the Bible has to say. But when will that establishment ever know, okay, now we have sufficient naturalistic knowledge to infer, you know, moral facts? Do you see the issue that I have? Like, this would not just be a problem for Catholics, but for all Christians altogether, if we were to interpret, you know, this thing that the gates of, you know, Satan will never prevail against these gates, right?
Mm-hmm. 1 second. Yeah, so apparently we got someone in the comments that's saying that he left Islam because of child marriage, right? He said like after the debate, it somehow made him leave Islam, right? So one, I don't know what religion like you were ascribing to before, because obviously, pretty sure everyone knows in Islam that this is allowed and that they know the age of Aisha, right? That's one. Two, if you didn't hold to the whole idea of Aisha being 9, I didn't bring anything really that would debunk the idea that she was older than 9. That's another point. And lastly, I just got a question. Noah, how many rak'ats are there when you do wudu? Is it 2 or 4?
Anyways, before he answer, well, he'll answer it in the chat, but you know, he says, I've become an atheist. So he did not have a faith.
How does that even follow?
You know, 1 second. He did not have a faith in God. Rather, he had a, I don't understand this notion, having a faith in a religion prior to having a faith in the existence of God. Like, okay, so he did not have a faith in God, right? He believed in God because Islam is true, right? And he takes Islam to be, prior to faith in the existence of God, which is a bit weird, right? Presumably, we would want to convince ourselves that God exists, right? Through the fitrah and whatnot, and through like cosmological arguments and whatnot, and then come up to pick a religion, right? If deism is rendered false, right? But this guy is like, oh, Islam is false, therefore I'm becoming an atheist, right? Ibrahim, if you want advice, you can add me on Discord, right? I'll add you there and try to help you as much as I can. But going back to what Noah said, right? I don't see how that follows, right? I think it's pretty much most likely a troll comment, could have been, right? But he says, do you have any idea how immoral that is? Again, do you have any syllogism to establish this act as immoral? Like, I'm very interested in anyone who could establish like a good argument, a good sound argument for this being immoral, right? If you could provide such an argument, I would be really interested in scrutinizing its soundness, i.e., the validity of the argument and the truthfulness of every single premise within the argument.
Yeah, I tell what I tell what I don't get as well, GGK. The whole idea of young marriages being in Islam. I don't think a debate of me defending the actual idea would have much bearing on this guy than taking the decision to leave Islam. If I was like expressing the idea that Islam teaches child marriage or young marriages when people are ignorant of that fact, not many people know, then sure, that'd be more believable. But the whole idea that this person has left Islam because I'm defending the act, well, did he not know that this is an act that we've been defending for like how long now? Like, has this guy been living under a rock or something?
Look, someone said it rightfully in the chat. Someone said, right, he went from an idea of right and wrong to having no morality, and now he's trying to take the moral high ground. By the way, most atheists, they hold to moral anti-realism or subjectivism about morals, right? They would not hold to, at least in the study of philosophy and metaethics, most atheists would not hold that there are objective morals. And if they would not even hold that these are known. That's the topic of moral epistemology. So what I'm advising you, Noah, is to go back into this live, right, where I addressed the idea, this entire argumentation from, naturalistic observations to infer morals, right? I am attacking that. I've raised some arguments against that, and I'm interested. Let's say all my arguments are bad. I'll grant that, right? Is there any argument to believe that morality has anything to do with natural observations? Is there any argument for moral naturalism? I'm interested. Please provide an argument for such, right? Once you can provide like an argument for such, I would gladly inshallah, maybe I don't have the time to like watch and maybe do an entire review of this because this is going to be very long. But inshallah, maybe we can have a stage discussion with anyone who wants to come, any person of any background, of any would want to come and give me an argument for moral naturalism. I'm interested to have such an argument, right? But again, as I wanted to say, if you go back into the live, you'll see some issues with moral naturalism, me calling for arguments for it, me dealing with some, and ultimately showing that if moral naturalism is false, you as a atheist who believe, in naturalism, right? Where do you get your morals from? Back to the case. So like, where do you get it? Where do you get it from? Anyways, go ahead.
Also, I just wanted to respond to this comment as well. Would it not have been better for your position to exclude Origen and Tertullian since their standing in the church is not reputable, to say the least? No, because I mentioned it from the very beginning. Despite them having heretical views, doesn't matter for my case. And despite the Proto-Evangelion of James not being canon, they're still valuable sources of history that lets us know the norm and the attitudes of the early church, right? It's like saying, they have no problem to take aspects from Tertullian and Origen's aspects of Trinitarian theology that they had. But when it comes to morality, no, they're a heretic. We can't take one bit from them. When it comes to history, no, they don't reflect at all on what the church would have believed, despite Origen being condemned as a heretic only 150 to 200 years after his death, right? Okay, but anyways, yeah, we can continue it, inshallah.
This strong idea we have to look at all past theologians and commentators as if they're infallible. There are plenty of things that early church fathers said that I disagree with. I don't think it's consistent with scripture or consistent with ethics or consistent with science. That's just a fact. I don't care.
Sure. Yeah, we can move on. I'm glad you're consistent though. So yeah, he's teaching that pedophilia is okay. Just to clarify.
he's teaching it, they have to be like physically and mentally developed. But again, this is a guy who is not dealing with kids.
He's making a Muslim argument, exactly.
He's not dealing with kids. He's not in his specialty, and he's talking about something for which he has very little knowledge on, considering who he was in his actual field and area of life. So I mean, like, this is just, I mean, if you want to look at actual medical experts of the day, like Albertus Magnus or Gals of Rome, they're going to say this is bad. And again, what were actual kings doing that actually had children? They're delaying the consummation of the marriage. Just going to Thomas Aquinas as if he is like some sort of like pillar on like medical stuff regarding children is like absurd. It'd be like me going to Michael Jordan and discuss nuclear energy.
I'm not claiming that. I'm not saying that because Aquinas agrees with it, hence it's now made more free and it's binding for you. What I am saying is you're going to have to concede that a doctor of the Catholic Church is teaching that pedophilia is okay. And that's a massive corruption. I don't think any Christian, like, I don't think any Catholic would want to say that Aquinas is allowing for pedophilia. I mean, such entailments is detrimental. Like, it's called.
Why
would you? Okay, would you take your religion from a pedophile?
Would I take my religion from a pedophile? No, my religion comes from Jesus.
Would you? I'm asking. Are you hypothetical?
I don't understand what you're actually asking here.
Yeah, you didn't want to answer that. I mean, I could skip a bit here because we're just talking about, like, he did concede that Aquinas was teaching pedophilia.
I mean, your positions a lot of the time are atheistic. You believe Job is a metaphor. You believe the prophet Job is a metaphor. You believe
no, that's not exactly my position. So no, Job.
I mean, is that a lot of people would not take a lot of views that you hold to, whether it be human evolution or the Job position you take or whatever it might be. For me as a Muslim and for a lot of traditional people, I would assume they don't think science has any implications on their ethics. You take a different view, which is fine. I'm going to address that. I'm going to deal with the science. We will do that. But just on the principle that apostolic succession deals with the fact that Jesus' teachings and the teachings sent from God are being established clearly for people, and the early church fathers are people that we look up to for morals and ethics. I would never, if I was a Christian, I would never want to concede that one of my biggest teachers in the Catholic Church is teaching pedophilia.
So, for example, Origen did something that he probably shouldn't have done, which is like castration. He did something like that.
Can I say something? Yeah, someone in the chat said a 17-year-old 264 days is not capable of giving consent after the 265th day, right? 200, right? But whatever. Yeah, like magically, that millisecond where the age turns 18, boom. Like, that sounds like Zeno's paradoxes. Zeno has one of the paradoxes where, the entire idea of the paradox is like, you have a threshold, right? And something is going to apply at that threshold. Is it really going to be the case that you cannot consider that application prior to that threshold? Really? Are you going to say that 1 millisecond ago, that person could not consent, but now it can consent? Really? Like, does that make any sense? I think this is you mentioned this the topic, the precautious. I don't know much about this. I'm not like a scientist on this, but yeah. But I see the other brother in the chat is talking about like Galatians 1:8. That's not the topic of the discussion, right? The discussion is this particular debate review. But to make it simple, we as Muslims do not believe that the Bible is wholly uncorrupted, right? Meaning that verse itself might be corrupted.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry. It's circular.
These people made mistakes. Origen, of course, taught a theological error of subordinationism. Okay, we don't look at church fathers the way you guys look at some of your Islamic scholars from the early years. We judge them based on the information they're presenting, and that it coheres with Scripture. This is why later councils come out and are condemning Tertullian on certain things, or Origen on certain things. Okay, because we can go back to what they say, see if it's in line with Scripture or not. We don't have to go, oh my goodness, we have to be in line with everything our church fathers said. That's not a Christian idea. That's an Islamic idea you're thrusting on us.
Has any pope condemned Aquinas for this view?
Not that I'm aware of, but then again, that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be.
Sure. So you're just taking a different view. I'm just letting Christians know that the view you're taking isn't representative of all Christians. A lot of Christians disagree with this, and entailments that come about from such a position is.
Show me where the majority of Christians today believe that it's okay to marry a 12-year-old and consummate a marriage with a 12-year-old.
The thing is, most people I would assume they would not have be okay with that, but that would be that would actually be because of their ignorance on this topic. Not many people know that Aquinas actually permitted this, or that canon law permitted this, or that the popes don't condemn such things. Once they show them,
and the moment you bring it up, they're going to be like, yeah, it should be.
I mean, I'll have to disagree on that. I mean, I can't show you any empirical evidence, just anecdotal references from conversations I do have with Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Christians. I mean, I even had a discussion with Eastern Orthodox Christian where he talked about how he doesn't like how you threw the Prophet Evangelion of James under the bus. A lot of Christians, especially Orthodox Christians, take a lot of traditions from such a historical document, even though they treat it as canon. So, I mean, I'm just showing that your position.
Okay, all of this is just appealing to popularity.
Yeah, maybe I can pull up that now, actually. Maybe I can pull up Eastern Orthodox website where the priest talks about this. I believe this is the website. Yep, this is the one. Now, I believe even the Catholic Church, if I'm not mistaken, takes a lot of traditions from the Proto-Evangelion of James. The early church, they took a lot of traditions from it, despite it not being canon. So yeah, here's the website. So the Proto-Evangelion of James is the website Orthodox Word, and this was written by an ex-Protestant, I believe. If we just check here. Yeah, so published by Father Jeremy, who grew up as a Protestant and became an Eastern Orthodox. He says in his article here discussing the Proto-Evangelion of James, he says, this is an ancient narrative which mostly falls in line with the teachings and traditions of the Orthodox Church. So most of it actually they take to be authentic and falls in line with what the Church teaches, even though they don't hold it to at par with the four Gospels. They still take many traditions from it, and it was preserved. A lot of these oral accounts are preserved by the early Church, and it was finally written down at 145 AD. So it's a good. It gives you a good idea of what the early Church saw to be the minimum age of marriage, as well as what the earliest documents were regarding like Mary's marriage or her age at first marriage.
Dean, if that's fine, really quick, right? Because I'll have to go soon. I'd like to do like a recap, if that's fine, and as short as I can, as far as I can remember, right? Because
of course,
I see a recap like beneficial here, because I see a lot of people asking questions which might be answerable in the past. So what I would like to recap here is that, first of all, inspiring philosophy took a position that is I would call it metaethics, like moral naturalism, which is that to give like a definition from the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, right? Moral naturalism as a form of cognitivism maintains that while a distinction can be drawn between moral facts and other kind of facts, moral facts are among the natural facts of the world, right? So moral facts are a subgroup of natural facts. And then there's two other positions, which is identity theory or supervenient theory. Identity theory holds that moral facts are just identical to natural facts, and the other theory holds that moral facts are just dependent upon natural facts, right? These are the two main subgroups of moral naturalism, which was employed by as a core assumption behind many of the arguments of inspiring philosophy. Why does this matter? Is because if this assumption is defeated, then the assumption, a lot of his arguments will fall apart. So what comments did I have on this? Well, first of all, I showed how the New Testament and church history might condemn this, right? By showing verses where Jesus condemns natural reason, like appeal to natural vain philosophy, appealing to spirits, appealing to stuff that are in the control of Satan being the god of the world, right? I also showed Jesus condemning anything that is not a source, of a command from God, right? And I showed the church fathers like Hilary of Poitiers and the first epistle of Clement, further strengthening this, right? Now, what was another issue? This was like the theological issue with it. Another reason that we went over was that, the conflict with the Catholic Church, right? Why does this matter? Hold on. Why does this really matter? We can just renounce Catholicism and make these arguments. Well, okay, but you would still consider Catholics as Christians, right? Why is it that 60% of the Christian world and the biggest establishment, the Catholic Church, which claims infallibility, as we've seen, right, which claims inspiration of these propositions that are consistent and with our position and inconsistent with IP's position, why is it that such a major segment of the Christian world has gotten it wrong? This is not just an issue of just renouncing Catholics and that's it. I can make my argument against, young marriages. This is an argument against, this is a problem for all Christians, right? So yeah, those are two issues theologically for a Christian to make such arguments, right? Now, a third issue I could think of, right? Presumably, what is immoral, God doesn't want you to do, right? God is against it, right? So presumably God will command you against it, right? So we would expect God to make those commandments within the Bible, right? Against these immoral things, right? If not, we can just simply say we can deal with the evolutionary of moral, like the problem of morals evolving, okay? So if our knowledge of certain moral facts is entirely reliant upon natural facts, then it's going to be the case that the Christian world will learn about new moral facts that it didn't know prior. But how is that consistent? How does that make any? How is that even probable? Why would God reveal a religion that has morals evolving over time based on observation? What if what if observation ceases, right? What if we all get cut off from, like, science and whatnot? How is this coherent with this idea of a community that is infallible? Satan will never hurt its gates, or I forgot what the verse says, right? This is like major issues between Christianity and this theory, right? That's one thing I would like to say, right? But yeah.
Did you want to leave now, or are you able to stay just a bit longer? How about we, if you can stay for a bit longer, we can, because it's about 15 minutes until we get to the 1 hour mark. We can maybe continue the reaction tomorrow, and we can.
Oh yeah, we can definitely. Oh, but look, I just realized I just mentioned the issues between Christianity and making such arguments. Really quick, if I could go, I would like to mention some philosophical issues. Again, moral naturalism used here, it requires justification. It's the burden on proof is on him, right? Presumably he's holding that young marriages are immoral, right? So he has to prove this, right? Now, he has to give an argument for this. By giving multiple arguments for this, natural facts are with what, with respect to evolution and naturalism is like, for example, how do we reconcile the agent's access to these morals, moral epistemology, right? How do we know moral facts? Presumably through our brain and reasoning, right? Now, our reasoning, our brain is built for natural selection, for survivability. It's not built for access to truth, right? Sometimes truth is useful and sometimes it's not. So what does it mean? When truth is not useful, then our brain will not track it. Our brain is not built for it, right? So presumably moral judgments which are true or false will not be included within the scope, which would render it blurry. Again, many issues with this theory of moral naturalism, right? Another issue, I could pop in, I think I would rather do a presentation thing, because they make a lot of moral arguments. I think we should make a whole presentation on this, right? Outside of this review, which could continue tomorrow and whatnot, right?
Yeah, sounds good, inshallah. I think if you want, we can go on until like the 1 hour mark, and then we continue tomorrow, and then you'll just be 1 hour left, and then we could do a Q&A at the end tomorrow, inshallah. What do you think?
By the way, really quick comment. I never said that he claimed that it's entirely dependent. I said if there are some moral facts that are entirely known through science, because that's what he says. So it's either the case that he holds that there are no moral facts that require science, in which case he would hold that they come from God, right? But then where is the condemnation? There is none. This is Dean's point throughout the video. So he has to hold that some moral facts like these are known solely through empirical observations, right? And that's what I was holding to. I was not charging him with believing that all moral facts require this, right? Or that they're entirely dependent on this. But yeah.
Yeah, that's a complete misunderstanding. Yeah. Are you okay with me playing until 1 hour, or do you have to go very soon?
Yeah, I do have to go very soon, though. You know very well, like we spent 1 hour and 15 minutes, so I think this would take another hour. You know what I mean? We can cut this video into multiple parts, or
Yeah, sounds good. Sounds good.
Here, even if I'm not present, we can have other guests like doing the review. Like, we can figure it out. I'll definitely probably be present tomorrow for part 2, right?
Inshallah. And yeah, if it happens to be that we do 3 parts, that's fine as well. I just want to incorporate a Q&A at the end of the last part, inshallah.
I would prefer to be present for the Q&A. That's the most interesting thing, right? If we can get every single person interested in this topic to have a Q&A or even a discussion, someone who thinks that he is strong in his position and he can advance arguments for moral naturalism. And also, I didn't touch on this, moral, like consequentialism about ethics. A lot of his arguments are, this is immoral because X and Y consequence. And I said, you even responded to him by giving him a hypothetical that denies the consequence, which is the way you argue. If someone gives you a consequentialist argument for the immorality of an act, all you need to do to refute him is to just conceive of the act without the consequence, right? Consequentialist arguments will never quite justify that an act is immoral, because you can just negate the consequence. Okay, so you're against, the topic is, are young marriages immoral? The topic is not, are young marriages with X and Y consequence immoral, right? Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah,
I would like to discuss all of these in the Q&A.
Yeah, inshallah, yeah, we can do that. Yeah, as you said, bro, it's about 2 hours now, so maybe inshallah we can continue part 2 tomorrow. What I might do is we'll do part 2 tomorrow, and then I'll set up Q&A maybe shortly after, or just like the day after tomorrow, inshallah. But
Yeah, look, not just the Q&A, just please allow the space for a discussion to be had, right? Maybe people coming on StreamYard and discussing about this, not just like, we can do a Q&A, right? But, I doubt that that'll be the interesting part. I think back and forward with people who think they can argue IP's position better than him, or they think they have, destructive arguments against our position, right? That would be interesting.
Yeah, jazakallah khair, GGK, for coming on the stream, and inshallah we'll see you in the next part. And yeah, guys, I pinned in the comment section his YouTube channel. Be sure to subscribe to him, inshallah. Also, I'll be putting his channel in the link in the description below. Inshallah, he'll be uploading content soon. And yeah, be sure to come for the next part and potentially a Q&A or a discussion that will come shortly after that. But yeah, without further ado, we'll stop the stream here, just about 2-hour mark. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.